Hey guys, I am on my way to Melrose to watch my seventh grader run in a cross country meet. So here are your notes for today. If you could please get your notes out. And as always, I got to talk kind of fast because I have a time limit, so feel free to pause me if necessary. Yesterday, we learned about epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues line and cover, and they are named according to the shape of their cells and the number of layers that they possess. Sometimes they also have some other additional features like having cilia or that type of thing. So naming epithelial tissues is as simple as identifying the shape of the apical layer and if there's a single layer or if there's multiple layers. So let's take a look at these examples from yesterday. Our first one here, if you try to identify a single cell. So a single cell is going to be basically, well, this is sideways, so you can't really tell that, but it is a rectangle. Always look for those nuclei. Those nuclei will be very helpful in identifying, where one cell starts and the next begins. So these round oval structures are the nuclei, and you can see that there's a single cell layer. So this is called simple columnar epithelium. Our second layer here, we're looking at this apical layer. This most superficial layer towards the surface is going to be made up of our epithelial tissue. Today we're going to talk about this deeper layer that's usually made of connective tissue. But you can see there's many, many, many layers. You can see lots of different nuclei here. And if we focus at the apical layer here, that's where the shape that we'll name after comes from. These cells are kind of squashed like a pancake. So we call this stratified for multiple layers, squamous epithelium. And then our third and final one here, we've indicated that it is this kind of ring of cells that's lining, this is actually in the kidneys, lining the lumen of the tubes that actually do the secretion and absorption that will create urine. And these cells are perfect little squares. But there is only a single layer of epithelium before, again, we get this kind of spongy or connective tissue underneath. So we call these simple cuboidal epithelium. So all of these tissues are epithelia, of course, because they have, they cover or they line. They are interacting directly with the environment, and they are providing the ability to absorb or secrete materials or offer protection. So we always name these epithelial tissues according to how many layers and the shape of that most superficial or that apical layer of cells. Okay, so today we're going to move on to our next type of tissue. These are connective tissues. Connective tissues are pretty much the exact opposite of our epithelial tissues. They are going to have fewer cells that are suspended in a non-living extracellular matrix. Oftentimes, they will also have supporting fibers that provide elasticity and strength to that tissue. The cells, because they're suspended in this extracellular matrix, do not have any free surfaces. So the apical, lateral, and basal that we discussed yesterday, that really only applies to epithelial tissues because connective tissue cells are completely surrounded by tissue on all sides, and they're highly vascularized. So they have really good blood supply and they have really good nerve supply. So what that means is that they're going to heal a lot more easily, and injuries to them generally are not as severe as we will see with our third and fourth types of tissue that we'll talk about the rest of the week, muscular tissue and nervous tissue, where the ability to repair and replace and to heal damage is a little bit different than with connective tissue. We, of course, have two exceptions to this rule, which are tendons and cartilage, two types of dense connective tissue. They do not have good vascularization, and therefore, if we have injuries to them, they're going to heal a lot more slowly than most of our other connective tissues, even slower than like a break in a bone. Bone is technically a connective tissue, and although it heals pretty slowly, it will heal completely if given enough time. Cartilage and tendons, they often require surgery in order to get those to heal properly. So here's just a general connective tissue. This is just called loose connective tissue. It can be found like deep to your skin. This is actually what your dermis is made of when we get to our integumentary system next week. We also see this lining a lot of our organs kind of in between the outer epithelial layer and the deeper muscular layers. We have this kind of gluey tissue that's holding everything together. So we can see that we have fewer cells. Remember, we can always identify cells because they generally have a nucleus and a cell membrane. They also stain pretty darkly when we're looking at some of these slides under the microscope. So we have cells here. They're not densely packed. They have a lot of space. They're just kind of floating around. We have an extracellular matrix, which is just this kind of background material. In the case of loose connective tissue, it's kind of a gelatinous type substance. And then we have all of these strings. These strings are just called extracellular matrix fibers, and they come in different varieties. And you can see they just kind of crisscross all over those connective tissues, giving them support. So this extracellular matrix, as I mentioned, is just the substance found between the cells, and it can contain those fibers and it provides strength and support. Many of our connective tissues are actually named according to their matrix, not according to their cells. So again, the connective tissues we're talking today are pretty much the opposite of the epithelial tissues that we talked about last week. Extracellular matrix fibers come in a couple different varieties, and there's a lot more than this. This is a little bit simplified because we don't really need to know all of them for the purposes of our class, but they're all made of proteins, and some of them are made of collagen, which is a very strong and flexible fiber. Some of them are elastic fibers, which gives more flexibility, but not quite as much strength. They're also much thinner because of the types of proteins that they're made of. And the thin and branching networks that you kind of see here, as the pink ones, are called reticular fibers. They're just kind of a scaffolding, if you will, that will hold these tissues together and give them some strength. So we can classify our connective tissues at the most basic level by when they are present in the human body. We have some types of connective tissue that are really important to the developmental process, and they're only present during those first 12 weeks of development, when we can still consider our developing human an embryo. After 12 weeks gestation, that embryo has now transitioned to be a fetus, and it no longer has embryonic connective tissues. It has adult connective tissues, which is a little strange. But these embryonic tissues have very unique features in that they often act as almost stem cells, and they can differentiate into many different tissue types for that developing embryo. So on the left, we have the mesenchyme that will become most of the connective tissue. So it will become the bone, the cartilage, the adipose tissue. All of that is originally mesenchyme in those first 12 weeks of gestation. And then in the umbilical cord, we have a very specialized tissue called the mucous connective tissue. This tissue will form the 2 veins and 1 artery that will keep that fetus sustained for the rest of its time in utero. But the tissues that I really want you to focus on learning and practicing, maybe if you're on Quizlet, you've already seen some of these because there's a lot of them. You'll have to be able to identify for your next lab quiz each tissue by name, and some of them you might have to know particular features of them, like this areolar or loose connective tissue we already looked at. You should be able to tell a fiber from a cell from the ECM. Pretty simple stuff. So remember that all of these tissues that you'll be identifying are only present in mature connective tissues. We use that word mature pretty loosely when we're talking anatomy. It's basically from a newborn to an adult has mature tissues. So here's just the first general types: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. They're just named according to how dense their fibers are. Dense connective tissue looks so packed full of fibers that the cells are actually squished in between. Sometimes when students are learning these tissues, they will think this looks like muscle. So be very, very careful when you're learning these tissues that you distinguish them, even putting them side by side or looking at them one right after another so you can tell the difference. The big difference here is the nuclei. In muscles, you're going to have big nuclei and big mitochondria. In this type of tissue, you really don't see those because the nuclei are so squished that they're pretty much invisible. Our next type of tissue is a little more specific. It's called cartilage. This is a really resilient connective tissue. It's very strong and it resists stretching and compression. It's found at the ends of your long bones as part of those joint capsules. You also have fibrocartilage in your intervertebral discs. So between the bones of your spine, you have these kind of pillows that are made of this really strong, resilient cartilage. You also have elastic cartilage in like your ear and your nose. That's actually very, very flexible. Not as strong as the other types, but still cartilage nonetheless. When we look at the microscope, I think of this looking like the chondrocytes cells look kind of like googly eyes. It's a weird mnemonic, but it works. The proteins also make it so the cartilage stains a really, really deep blue versus the pinks and purples that we see in a lot of other slides. Bone, I hope, is one of the easier tissues that you'll be able to identify because it has a solid extracellular matrix. Its cells are called osteocytes or osteoclasts, and they are hanging out in these dark areas that kind of look like little spiders, and they have these little canals called canaliculi that will help the watery part of the extracellular matrix kind of flow through. So your bones are connective tissue. They repair and replace. They can be compact or spongy, and we're going to learn all about them more in Unit 3. Here's another hopefully really easy connective tissue for you to learn. It is your blood. So it consists of cells and cell fragments, and the extracellular matrix here is liquid called plasma. The rest of the parts of the blood, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, are referred to as the formed elements. So when we have an epithelial layer and then a connective tissue underneath, it can form some really interesting structures inside of the human body that are really important, referred to as membranes. These, again, are going to cover or line parts of the body, and they're really, really important for our body to interact with its environment. Membranes can come in a couple of different types. Mucous membranes are the ones that are going to line body cavities that are going to be interacting directly with the environment. So that's going to be your whole digestive tract and your respiratory tract. It also produces that sticky substance that we're used to coughing up called mucus. That mucus has a job, and that's to prevent things from getting down deeper into like your respiratory tract, or to create a kind of lubricant to get things through the digestive tract without getting too sticky. Body cavities that don't open to the exterior, like around your pleural cavity and your pericardial cavity, are lined with serous membranes. Then we have our cutaneous membrane, which is our skin, and we also have joint cavity membranes called synovial membranes. So here we have a close-up view of our cutaneous membrane on the top, our synovial membranes on the bottom. In both cases, we have different secretions that help these membranes do their job. For your skin, it's of course to be waterproof and prevent materials from entering the body. For your joint cavities, it's again lubrication and allowing those joints to move very, very freely. All right, so that's it for notes for today. The rest of the hour is yours to hopefully wrap up and finish exercise 3. Just a quick reminder, you should be coloring, labeling all of your diagrams and answering the questions at the end. Don't forget to turn in your Chapter 4 homework, and your Chapter 5 homework is due a week from today, which is Tuesday, September 26th. Feel free to reach out over Remind or email if you have any other questions, and I will see you guys tomorrow.